I'm ready to continue with what we were talking about. Actually, today we're going to start. Today's kind of the end of our big unit about ranked elections. That's everything that we've been talking about so far. Is all about elections in which people rank their choices, and then you add it up in some way. There was, the ranked choice, the Borda, whatever. I have just two more interesting voting systems to talk about. That they don't perfectly fit into the same sort of family as the ones that we've been talking about. So I'll just call this like two leftover important voting systems. Although they're a little different from the other ones that we've talked about, so we're not going to try to analyze them in the same way. And actually, we're not going to say too much about these, but you may see some basic questions about them on the homework assignment. And then after this, we're going to move on to something completely different. Still about voting, but really a very different type of voting. So, two leftover important voting systems. The first one sounds silly, but it actually has very interesting mathematical properties, and it is useful in the real world often. It's called the random dictator method. I put a B. Random dictator. Random dictator. All right? The random dictatorship method. Here's how you do it. You tell everybody to vote just like usual. Remember, the ordinary dictator, the non-random dictator, is one person is decided ahead of time. They're the dictator, and then just whatever they say, that's the winner. But the random dictator works like this. Everybody votes. They send in their ballots or whatever, and it's like you put all the ballots in a big hat, and you reach your hand in and pull one out at random, and that's the winner. That's how you do the random dictator method. All right, everybody votes. One vote is selected at random. You don't know ahead of time who's going to be the dictator. That's why it's called the random dictator. One vote is selected at random. And then that ballot determines the winner. Just the one that you pull out of the hat. And you don't consider any of the other ballots. Right? It's like dictatorship, but it's got this random element to it. Everybody votes. You choose one of the votes at random, and that one chooses the winner. All right? This sounds crazy, and I could tell when I said that. I saw some looks on some faces that indicated that you think that this is a crazy method, and it is kind of crazy. But actually, it's less crazy than it seems. So I will say less crazy than it seems. For example, there's some randomness to it, right? Which is immediately quite different from the typical systems that we use in the real world. But, for example, if everybody in this class is voting about, say, your favorite movie or whatever, and 75% of you voted for Star Wars, what do you think is going to happen when I pull a vote out of the hat? If 75% of you said Star Wars, actually there is a 75% chance that Star Wars will be the winner, right? So actually, from that point of view, it seems quite reasonable. In fact, almost perfect, doesn't it? I mean, from a probabilistic point of view, from a statistical point of view, this actually accomplishes exactly the will of the people in some kind of probabilistic sense. So I will say something like, if X% of people have some opinion, then that opinion will win X% of the time, which from a certain point of view, that seems exactly right. That seems like exactly how you want things to work. If X% of people have some opinion, then this, this opinion wins X% of the time. So from that point of view, actually, this is a great system, almost almost like mathematically perfect. Like it accomplishes exactly the will of the people in some kind of a probabilistic sense. The obvious issue with this is like you wouldn't want to do this when you're, say, voting for the President of the United States, just because I feel like that is too important to roll the dice on, right? Because you might get a bad result. You might just by chance pull out a name which only 5% of the people actually voted for, and that seems like maybe that's not the way to do it. But I will say there are situations in which I believe this is a great way to do things. So I would say this is, how about this? Works great for, I will say, repeated low stakes decisions. Low stakes because you don't want one of these random pulls out of the hat to nuke the planet or something like that. You don't actually want any one of these random choices to have super high stakes because they're random. But actually, the thing that I would like to emphasize is this: repeated, right? Everybody knows the way that probabilities work. Like, flipping a coin, you got a 50-50 chance of heads or tails. But if you just flip it only like 2 or 3 times, you might actually get the same result every time. That's just by chance. The only way you actually realize that 50% probability is if you do it over and over again, right? So that's why I said it works great for repeated. If you're doing this over and over again, this lets the probabilities sort of even out, right? If you're only going to do it once, then really the randomness is kind of an obstacle because you really don't know what's going to happen if you only do it once. But if I'm going to do this, say, every day for the rest of my life, then I don't mind doing it by some kind of random means, just because whatever deviations from the statistics are going to be kind of temporary, and if I do it over and over again thousands of times, then it's not going to matter in the long run, right? So this works great for repeated low-stakes decisions. So I would say not good to use in politics, but if, I don't know, if you and your roommates have to decide every day who's going to do the dishes tonight, now you could have a specific schedule, and everybody's got to remember the schedule. People are going to argue, what if I go home for the weekend, then do we move the schedule, or do I just get out of it? How about you just decide randomly? If you're going to do it just once, then that seems unfair. But if you're going to do it 100 times, then it's probably going to work out all right. I have 2 kids, and the 2 kids take turns doing the dishes every night. We don't do it randomly, though. We argue every night. Who did it last night? And then they will try. If someone's not around, they're like, no, I don't have to do it that night. Maybe we should just flip a coin every night. They'd probably get upset about that, too. But it would be fair. All right, this is the random dictator method. Actually, this is used, I happen to notice, this is used when you play Mario Kart online. I don't know if you're familiar with this. When you play Mario Kart online, everybody, all the people are like, before the race starts, it's like you and 10 other random people are waiting for the race to start. And you get to vote about what track you want the next race to be on. And the way the vote works is like each person chooses their vote, but it doesn't actually choose the answer based on who got the most votes. It puts all the votes up like on a board, and then there's this little like roulette style random thing, and it randomly chooses one of the votes out of the board. All right? That's the random dictator method, when everybody votes and then one of those votes is randomly chosen. All right, so it is, and that's a perfect example of that is extremely low stakes and repeated. It happens over and over again. So even if your vote doesn't get picked very often, it's still, nobody says that's unfair. All right. Another great thing about this system, and we're not really going to say much more about this, but I'll have some questions on the homework about it. Also, this defeats what they call the tyranny of the majority. This is actually a big deal. I mean, people in political science, I don't know about modern political science, but this is something that, for instance, the people who created the United States were very concerned about this concept, the tyranny of the majority. And this was one of the major objections just to the concept of democracy. Like when democracy was proposed in the United States, all the like kings or whatever in Europe were like, that's a stupid idea because there's no way democracy could actually work in the real world. And one of the big kind of things that people were concerned about democracy was this, the tyranny of the majority. And this, the concept is a simple one. It just says that if 51% of the voters agree on something, they can get their way 100% of the time. This is a true fact about the way that democracies work. And this is called the tyranny of the majority. If 51% of the voters agree on something, then every time you vote, that 51% is going to win. And from a certain point of view, you might think, well, if 51% of the voters agree on something and 49 agree on the opposite, then maybe we should somehow split the difference and give it to the 51 half the time and give it to the 49 half the time. But actually, if you vote every time, that's not how it works. If you vote every time, what's going to happen is the 51% get their way all the time, which doesn't really seem very fair. This was a major philosophical objection to the concept of democracy in the first place. And the people who wrote the Constitution or whatever, you can read about their thoughts about the tyranny of majority. I believe, I'm not an expert in the history of the Constitution, maybe some of you know more than I do, but I believe the people, one of the major reasons for the American concept of the separation of powers was to avoid the tyranny of majority. So rather than just having a Senate, which makes every decision just the Senate and that's it, you don't have anything else, if you had only one group of people voting to make every decision, then you will have this problem. The tyranny of the majority will be unbreakable. Instead, we have a fairly complex structure to the way that decisions are made, where we have the Congress and the Senate and the President and the Supreme Court all playing sort of different roles. A large part of that structure was intended to disrupt the issue of the tyranny of the majority. All right, but this, in my opinion, is one of the great benefits of the random dictator method, because this whole concept is just not an issue if you're using the random dictator method. If you're using the random dictator method and 51% of the people agree about something, they're going to get their way 51% of the time. And the other folks are going to get their way 49% of the time, which is, that totally resolves this issue. All right, any thoughts about the random dictator method? Don't do this to elect the president, but maybe do this to, do the dishes or something. All right? I think it's interesting. As I sort of like, in mathematics or in life in general, I kind of like things which seem ridiculous on the surface, but when you look closely, actually it makes a lot of sense. That's how I feel about the random dictator method. All right, one last sort of miscellaneous method, which is also quite different from the other ones that we've talked about, but this is also important and very useful in the real world, and it doesn't really sound all that crazy. This is called approval voting. This one fits a little bit more closely to the ones that we've talked about so far. Approval voting. All right. The way that this works is, I will say, voters don't rank their choices. But just choose which options they approve of. You don't say who's best, who's second best, who's third best. You just say yeah, out of those choices, I like this one and this one and that one. And I don't like the other ones. All right, so a typical ballot, in an approval election looks something like you know, A, B, C, D. And rather than ranking them, you as the voter, you just say like, yeah, I like this one and I like this one. That's how you vote in an approval voting election. You do not rank them in order. You just say which ones you like and which ones you don't like. All right, and then how you find the winner, you take all the ballots and you add up, you know, just how many check marks each of the candidates got. All right, so you add up all the approvals, and the one who gets the most wins. The one who got the most check marks, right? That's how approval voting works. It's, it's very similar to the system that we use, say, to elect the president. It's basically plurality, where you just check off one person who you like on your ballot. Approval voting is the same idea, but you can check more than one person if you want to. You can just say I only like this guy, but if you want to, you can say I like this guy and this guy and this guy. That's how approval voting works. So let's just do a real sort of simple example here. I'm going to try to make some kind of a chart the way that we have for our other examples, but the chart is not about rankings. It's just about who approves of who. So I'm going to put my candidates down the side here, A, B, C, D, and let's say 23 people marked A and B. So this means 23 people approved of A and B. Let's say 37 people approved A and D. Let's say 4 people approved only C. This is what a typical approval election will look like when you are adding up the results. 21 people approve B and D. Let's say 3 people approve everybody. I don't know if you're wondering, am I allowed to just check them all off? Yeah, sure. Let's say 5 people approve nobody. And 7 people approve only B. All right. This is what a typical results of an approval election would look like this. Anybody wondering what's the point of voting for nobody? You are allowed to vote for nobody in an approval election. What's the point of that? The answer is there's not really a point of that. If you vote for nobody, if you are just saying I don't approve of any of these people, your vote will not really matter at all because none of your checks will add up to anybody's total. Anyway, let's see. Can we add up the totals? So the totals. You just count up how many total approvals did each of these candidates get. So to count up, how many check marks did A get? Well, I see 4 on the chart for A, but these 4 represent different numbers. So this one, there were 23 approvals from these people, plus another 37, plus another 17, plus another 3. So the total for A is 23 plus 37 plus 17 plus 3. Doing some real math now. This added up, that's 60 and another, that's 80, I believe. All right, this is pretty straightforward. I hope you see how this works. So how many does B get? B gets 23 here, and then 21 and 3 and 7. So this is 23, 21, 3 and 7, which adds up to 54. I did this ahead of time so I wouldn't mess it up. C, when I add up the votes for C, I get 4, 17, and 3. That's 24. 4 plus 17 plus 3. 24. And for D, I get 37, and 21, and 3 is 61. And so A is the winner. That's how we do approval voting. All right. This is a nice system. I like approval voting. It is not really possible to analyze in the same terms that we have from before about the Condorcet winner or the unanimity or something like that, because those criteria are all about how do you rate one candidate above another or another candidate below another. But you don't do that in the approval for instance, these people here, they approved of A and B. I suppose that means like they like A better than C, but actually we don't know if they like A better than B, and we also don't know if they like C better than D. So you can't quite analyze it in the same way, but it's still a perfectly sensible system, and you get a winner like that. Like I said, there's no effect for voting for nobody. Actually, there's another vote in here which also has no effect on the results. Anybody? Yeah.
Okay, so what in the case of number 5, right, which doesn't have anybody,
Yes.
right? What if number 5, in a sense, theoretically, got the most votes, being none of the above?
Yeah.
Could we then maybe that's a sign that you have to do another election?
Right. Yeah. This is a good thing. So you might you could consider, for example, A got 80 approvals. Now that's more than anybody else. So
Clearly,
in that sense, A is better than anybody else. But you should also consider in an election like this, like what percentage of the voters actually approved of A. Now in this case, I'm not prepared to tell you that number, but you could figure that out by adding up the total number of voters and then what percentage of them actually voted for A, which is 80 of them voted for A. If you had, say, 500 people voted for nobody, that would signal that even though A got more approvals than anybody else, maybe they still were disapproved by a majority of the voters. Yeah, so I would say this column here, 5 people who voted for nobody, they don't affect the results. Like they had no effect on who wins, but they could have some effect on what percentage of people voted for each of these.
is there a system where none of the above could win? Is there any system like that?
This is a good question. He asked, is there any system where like none of the above can be the winner of the election? I am not familiar with such a system. I mean, you could, for instance, look at all of these approvals and choose just the column which had the most votes, and then say those people both win. If you were doing it that way and say this one had the most votes, then you would say, I guess nobody won. Yeah, I don't know of a real world system which allows for nobody to win. Although there are rules, like for example, in the American presidential elections, you have to win the Electoral College to become the president. In fact, you have to win more than 50% of the electoral votes to become the president. And if nobody gets 50%, then there is no winner, and I believe it's decided by the Senate. The Senate votes. There's some technicality in that case. So there are systems in which it is possible, in theory, that nobody wins. In the real world, usually they have some kind of a fallback technicality rule to break the tie or whatever. Anyway, I was saying, this is a good question. I believe there's someone else. So like I said, these 5 people, they really did not have any effect on the results. I believe there are other people in here who also did not have any effect on the results. Anybody feel like it? Yeah, these 3 people who voted for everybody. I think if you think about this, you'll agree. Actually, voting for everybody, in terms of the math of how this works out, voting for everybody is basically the same as voting for nobody, right? Voting for nobody, you don't affect the totals at all. Voting for everybody means you're going to add 1 onto everybody's total, but that has no effect on who's going to win or not, right? So it's a fact. In approval voting, I will say approving everybody is equivalent to approving nobody in terms of affecting the results of the election. All right. When you do this in the real world, if the people who are voting understand the system, basically nobody is going to vote for everybody because they know that will not actually make their vote matter in the long run, and also nobody's going to vote for nobody either, because that will not affect the results. All right. This is a nice system to use among voters who are skeptical of the sort of ranked methods. Some people say that ranked choice is just too complicated. For such people, maybe approval voting is a little more palatable. It's less complicated seeming than, say, the ranked choice or the Borda or something like that. Approval voting is also very easy to calculate the winner. Like figuring out who's the winner using Borda or the ranked choice can sometimes be kind of complicated. You have to go through the rounds or whatever. The approval, though, is very easy to add up all the checks or whatever, and that's all there is to it. The approval voting, I will say, this tends, when you do this in the real world, it tends to elect sort of middle ground candidates. Right? Like, for instance, if your candidates exist on some kind of political spectrum, and you have sort of somebody on the far left, let's just call them A, B, and C, right? If you have somebody on the far left, somebody on the far right, and somebody in the middle, you can imagine that many people might approve of A and B, and then many other people might approve of B and C, right? Just because B is as sort of a compromise, maybe everybody kind of is okay with B, although maybe they like A and C a little bit better, each one of them. You can see how in such a scenario, the B will end up getting much more approvals than the people on the two ends. Because in an approval election, somebody who's capable of satisfying the two extremes is going to do very well. Rather than if you force people to only vote for one person, actually that favors the extremities, which is kind of the way that our politics has been going lately in America. So anyway, the approval tends to elect middle ground candidates. You know, if you're thinking about using approval to do something important, this is just something you have to keep in mind. That's just the way that the system works. The approval voting is actually near and dear to my heart. Personally, I'll tell you, if you don't mind, a little personal story about approval voting. When I came to our dear university, Fairfield University, as a young professor, we have like faculty committees, committees to decide things going on around campus, approve new courses, that kind of stuff, and we have elections to decide who's going to be on these committees. And I was shocked to learn when I came to Fairfield University, we use the plurality system. And I was like, man, this is garbage, because I don't like the plurality system. It was especially garbage because a typical faculty election for one of these committees, it's like there's 10 people on the ballot. And using plurality is really bad in that situation, because everybody is just going to check one person out of 10. And so when you add up the votes, you end up with somebody winning with like 20 votes when there were like 3 other people who had 15 votes, you know. This is a scenario which would be much better done using some kind of ranking or approvals, right? And I started talking to my buddies. I said, you know, we really shouldn't be using the plurality system on these elections. And most people didn't know what I was talking about. And some people said that I was crazy. They were like, no, we vote. This is like a democratic thing. And I was like, yeah, I know. I'm talking about voting too. It's just like we should do it differently. And they're like, no, voting. We have to vote. But anyway, it was a long journey. It took me like, I think 5 years. I waged a long campaign, but eventually I convinced the Fairfield University faculty to switch to approval voting. They didn't want to switch to ranked rankings just because ranking is more complicated for the voters to think about, especially if you have like 10 people on the list. You're really going to make me choose a specific ranking of all 10 of those people? Actually, it's a lot easier to ask people to just do say who you approve of and who you don't approve of. So this is used by the Fairfield University faculty.
Theoretical question.
Yeah.
Okay, so now based that this is a Jesuit university, right? And the
Yes.
Jesuits, their favorite word is discernment, right?
Okay.
You know, they say it all the time, right? In a sense, are you, in a sense, teaching like this idea of voting by discerning the way that you vote, which would be very Jesuit? I mean, have you thought of it that way?
I have not thought of it that way. I'm not sure what
I'm
you
a
mean.
religious man,
You
so I
mean
think this way, okay?
if you
But, yeah.
I-
Because it seems very Jesuit. Well, we don't have to vote this one, we can vote this one.
Uh-huh.
You know, treasuring the question over the answer.
Okay. Yeah, I like that. I haven't thought. I think I actually personally am not. I don't feel a strong connection to the Jesuit tradition of the university. Although I do. I think what you're saying, like, I as a mathematician and just as a person in general, I do like to do things for reasons, and I recognize in life there are many different ways to do most things. So maybe this is a Jesuit.
Seems very Jesuit.
Yeah. All right, great. I'm all in with the Jesuits now. Yeah. I haven't thought of it that way. All right, great. Us professors, university professors, it's a real big deal to get tenure, right? You've probably thought about this or heard about this. I will tell you, when you have to sort of apply for tenure after you've been here for a while, and it helps. It's not necessary, but it certainly helps to get tenure if people, like the other faculty and even the administrators, sort of know who you are around campus. This is a bit of advice that you get when you become a professor. They're like, you should go to lunch in the dining hall and just meet people so that they know who you are. So when you apply for tenure, they're not like, who's that guy? When I applied for tenure, they're like, oh, that's that approval voting guy. And I think it's a small thing, but it was important to my professional career advancement, I think. All right, this is why we have such awesome faculty committees. I have no idea if it really matters in what we're doing. But all right, any thoughts about that? Approval voting is a good system. It's very easy to do and not so hard to convince people that it makes sense to use approval voting. All right. One person asked me, I had to present this to the whole faculty, and one professor said, if you let us vote for as many as we want, that is disenfranchisement. Remember this word? Somebody said to me, you can't allow one person to vote for 5 people, but somebody else is only voting for one person. Anyone have an answer to that? Is it unfair if you let somebody vote for 5 people while somebody else is deciding to vote for only one person? Yeah, my answer was it's not unfair, because you get to pick how many you're voting for. And I think it sounds like the person voting for 5 person is as if their vote counts 5 times as much, but it actually doesn't, because we already know if you want your vote to count a lot, then you should vote for everybody. But actually that has no effect on the result. So it's not so simple maybe as it seems on the surface. Somebody else said to me, hey, in the faculty, we're all friends with each other, right? So isn't everybody just going to vote for everybody? Because it's I like all those people. I'm going to vote for everybody every time. And then everybody's going to vote for everybody, and we'll just get a huge tie every time we do one of these elections. And I said, I don't think that's really going to happen. And it doesn't happen. I think when people think about it for a moment, they realize that you shouldn't vote for everybody. That won't affect anything. All right. Any other thoughts about approval? Yeah.
How did you get the committee to switch to the other type of voting? Did you all take a vote to switch it to that?
Yes, actually. Yeah.
What method did you
Yeah.
use?
So we use the plurality system to vote. Yeah. Right. That's sort of it's how it has to go. Yeah, it was a little different because I'm talking about we changed the way that the committees were elected, but the vote about should we make the change or not, that was just like a yes/no vote. It wasn't like who do we approve of, and there were only two options, so it was easy to do.
How did the people on the committee vote?
I think pretty much everybody agreed with me. Is that what you mean?
No, like you use the approval voting to like vote for who's on the committee.
Yeah.
But once people are on the committee, how do those people vote? What system do they use when they vote on actions?
Right. Usually, the actions of the committees are just like yes or no. It's like somebody wants to create a new major, and the committee has to say, yes we should or no we shouldn't. And in that case, you use plurality. Like these other methods are really only useful when there's more than two options. But I have heard, so there's another important election that happens everywhere around campus is every department has a department chair, which is elected by the rest of the department. And the math department started using approval after we switched for the general faculty. And I have heard every so often somebody says, hey, we just elected our department chair using approval voting to kind of make me feel better about all the lasting impact that I've had on this institution. Like I said, I don't actually think it makes much of a difference, probably in practice, but it's a good thing to do. All right. Great. Approval voting. Tell your friends. So that's it for that sort of voting. What I want to talk about next, and for the next couple weeks, we're going to move into something really quite different. The main topic is called weighted voting. Weighted voting. This is for all the folks out there who really want to talk about the Electoral College. The Electoral College is an example of a weighted voting system. The Electoral College is a sort of special technicality that we use to elect the President of the United States, and only the President of the United States. The Electoral College otherwise has nothing to do with anything. It is an example of a weighted voting system in which this is, I will say, usually a small number of voters. When we talk about weighted voting, it's always going to be like 4 or 5 voters. So you typically don't think of this on sort of large national scale types of votes. Usually a small number of voters, and each has a different, this is the important part, each has a different weight. That weight, the word weight means sort of like how much their vote counts. All right. Weighted voting is used most typically in things like corporate voting, say like the board of a company or something, especially of a publicly traded company, like a company with stockholders, where each person owns a different percentage of the company, and when they vote about something, their votes count according to their stake or their percentage of ownership or whatever. So I will say, like in corporate board votes, I will say something like number of votes depends on like how much of the company you own, or your investment, or whatever, your ownership stake, right? Companies that sell stocks, it's like if you somehow can buy up 10% of the stock, it means your vote is proportional to that amount of the stock that you have. And if you can somehow get 51% of the stock, it means you now run the company. You can make all the decisions based on your ownership stake. All right. And the Electoral College also works in this way. If you think of the 50 states as individual entities, they each contribute different amounts of votes to the Electoral College. And it's the same kind of a situation. So I will say also, Electoral College more or less fits into this framework. If we think of the different states, as, say, 50 different individual voters. With different, well, the word we use is different weights. All right, and for example, the way that the Electoral College specifically works is like California is the biggest state. It goes by population. California is the most populous state, and they get 55 votes in the Electoral College. The next one is Texas. I wrote down a few of these. Texas gets 38 votes. The next biggest ones are Florida and New York, which each get 29, etc. You know, there's the whole list of these. The smallest one is Delaware, and there's Delaware, I believe, is tied with some others, which gets only 3 votes. Actually, 3 is the minimum because the rule is your state gets the same number of electoral votes as the number of people you have in the Senate and in Congress. Every state every state gets 2 senators. That's how the Senate works. And then as far as the Congress goes, you get seats on the Congress according to your population. So the smallest possible would be 2 senators plus 1 in the Congress, and that's what Delaware and a few others have. And the biggest possible would be, you know, California has 2 senators plus 53 representatives in the Congress. So anyway, this is how the votes in the Electoral College system work. And then in the individual states, they use the plurality system mostly to decide who wins each state. But I'll say when someone wins in a state, maybe I'll say it, how do I want to say this? They get all those they get all of those electoral votes. They win all of that state's electoral votes. Actually, this is not entirely true. There are 2 states which recently have decided to split their electoral votes according to the percentages of people who voted for each of the candidates. So I will just, this is a technicality, except for Maine and Nebraska. So it is possible to win it's possible to win like some of the votes from Maine and lose some of the other ones. They divide them up according to the congressional districts within the state. But for all of the other states, it's all or nothing. If you win, say, in the state of California, if one candidate gets 51% of the vote and the other gets 49, it's not like they split up those 55 points, 50-50. They give them all to the one who won and none of them to the person who lost. All right? This is very controversial, the Electoral College system. If you look at the politics as it exists today, basically the Democrats hate the Electoral College system and the Republicans love it. That's because with today's political landscape, the Electoral College system benefits the Republicans a lot and it hurts the Democrats a lot. Basically because Republicans today tend to be supported. They have stronger support in the smaller states, and the Democrats have stronger support in the bigger states, the more populous states. And the effect of that is that the Republicans will pick up a lot of these little states, which get 2 senators plus 1 representative. This is how the Republicans can win the presidency, even though they got fewer votes. Like if you just count up all the people in the country, For instance, Hillary Clinton got more individual votes from people than Trump did, but Trump won because of the way it worked out with the Electoral College. And the same is true for George Bush the first time when he beat Gore. Gore had more individual votes. Yes?
If everyone voted, if all these people voted the way that their state voted, would that not be a public issue? Is it because like that happens because the electoral college voted?
I'm not. So if it were really the case that, say, 100% of the people in California voted the same way, is that what you mean?
If like Massachusetts we picked like Trump whatever, and then our electoral college voted, or our representatives voted for.
That doesn't really happen. I don't think I understood the question.
I think she's
Sorry.
asking, can only the number of like individual votes be higher than, like, can the winners be different for the populist vote versus the electoral college vote, only when like state representatives don't vote for who their state voted for?
Oh.
It can happen even when they do vote in line with.
That's right. Yeah, there is such a thing as, like, it is technically legal for the Electoral College. There are like individuals who actually, there's like actual 55 different people who actually cast these votes. And in many cases, it is actually legal for them to just say, like, I'm not gonna vote the way that my state voted. This is very rare and has never actually had an effect on the result of the election. But it can happen. But yeah, it's true that, like, that's not what I'm talking about. So even if everybody is voting in line with the way that their state went, you can still have somebody become the president without getting a more popular votes than the other person.
Reason for it,
There's a reason for it.
for the electoral college.
Oh, sure. Yeah, there were like historical reasons why this system exists at all. Although this also is very controversial. I mean, I'm not a serious scholar of American history. There are serious scholars of American history who say that the only purpose of the Electoral College was to preserve the institution of slavery and to preserve sort of, the Electoral College was an institution of white power. Like I said, I'm not an expert in the history, and I don't know so much about that. There are people today who say things like, the Electoral College is necessary to give some more power to the smaller states, because if you don't have the Electoral College and you do everything according to the popular vote, what that means is that the presidency will basically always be determined by voters in big cities because there's more of them than everybody else. And maybe you don't want that. I would say, you don't need to hear my opinion. There are many people who really hate the Electoral College, though. It tends to be a partisan issue, though, which makes me have a hard. It's hard to tell what is genuine versus what is just political games, because the Democrats can win more if they get rid of the Electoral College. Are they doing it just so that they can win, or do they actually have real reasons? I have my own opinions about this, but I don't want to get too much into that. Anyway, this is an example of a weighted voting system. Let me just say some terms. We've got about 10 minutes here. We can get down to some details. We're going to talk about the Electoral College as a particular example of weighted voting every so often. So, first of all, we're going to focus just on sort of yes-no votes, all right? So these are votes in which there are only two possible outcomes. This automatically makes things a lot simpler than the other voting systems that we've been talking about so far, which have to do with ranking several alternatives. We're just going to focus on votes which are yes or no. And here's some basic terminology. Each voter has what we call a weight, which is a number, which is basically just how many votes that person gets. Each voter has a weight. And there is what we're going to call a quota. That is how many votes you need in order to win. This is how many votes you need to win. All right. For instance, in the Electoral College, anybody know how many votes do you need in the Electoral College to win? 270. Yeah, I think there are 538 electoral votes total. So you need 270 to win. So that in the Electoral College, that's the quota. And then each of the weights is just all the different weights of the states. All right. So this is how many votes you need to win. Now, in the case of the Electoral College, you need more than 50%. That's what determines a win. Although we are going to discuss some situations, I will just say this is not always going to be 50%. You probably know there are many different voting scenarios in which they say there's some special rule. You need to get 2/3 in order to win this kind of vote or something like that. So we're going to allow for that kind of scenario also. So the quota is not always going to be 50%, although, sometimes it will be. All right? Let's just talk about a simple example. So a typical example, the examples here do not look anything like the examples from the ranking stuff because there's no rankings or whatever. I am going to write it this way. Let's say we have 5 voters with weights of 12, 10, 5, 1, and 1. All right? So let's just imagine you have some kind of corporate board meeting or something, or like a tiny little electoral college in which there are 5 different individuals, and those are the weights that they each have. And I also have to tell you what the quota is in order for us to think in a sophisticated way. And let's just imagine the quota is 20. You need to get to 20 in order to win this election. All right. And the major question, so actually we're going to vote, we'll write it, this little notation, like this. I'm not going to write those words, this many voters, the weights, or whatever. I'm going to summarize that whole thing like this. 20, and then a colon, 12, 10, 5, 1, 1. So that is how we're going to write one of these weighted voting scenarios. I'm always going to use those brackets, and then the first number you see is the quota. So this is the quota, and then these other numbers in a list are the weights. All right. And the big question that we are always going to ask about a system like this is, who has the power in this system? All right. That's the overarching question. Who has the power and how much? How much power do each of these voters actually have? All right. So, for example, one easy answer to this question is, well, there are 5 different people here. These are their weights. Obviously, 12 has the most power. The 12 is the one with the most weight, right? And I suppose the 10 has a little bit less, and then the 5 has a little bit less, and these 2 guys have the same amount of power, and it's less than, a lot less than the others. All right, that's what it seems on the surface. All of that, what I just said, is not quite true, and that's what's interesting about weighted voting. Who has the power and how much? I will say the answers are not obvious. The answers are not obvious. For example, let's look at the 12 and the 10. Does the 12 have more power than the 10 in this system? Now, obviously, the 12, 12 is a bigger number than 10. But looking at the specific arrangement of this system, actually, in my opinion, the 12 is not any more powerful than the 10. Anybody agree with me? You have to think about what the quota is. So in order to actually get your way, you have to somehow get together 20 points, right? In order to meet the quota. Anybody have any thoughts about this? Yeah.
Even if you have all the votes, it doesn't add up. Oh wait, yeah, it does. But if you have,
So what she's thinking about is exactly what you need to think about. What are the various ways that you could actually get to the 20 here? If you just think about all the different possible ways that people could vote, how could we actually make it to 20? Sorry, I have to scroll. I'm going to pull this down with me. How can you actually get to 20 in this case?
12 needs 5, 1, and 1 to get that.
Actually, if you have 12 and 5 and 1 and 1, that's still not enough, right? That adds up to 19.
So it needs
How do you get to 20? I think the only way to make it to 20 is to use the 12 and the 10 together, right? That's any other combination. Well, certainly the 12 and the 10 plus some of these guys too. But to get to 20, we need 12 and the 10. All right? I think what that means is actually the 12 is not more powerful than the 10. In this particular arrangement of the numbers, there's no difference really in the power between the 12 and the 10. Because if you want to make it to 20, you need both of them. You cannot say add the 10 plus the other ones to make it. You also cannot add the 12 plus the other ones to make it up to 20. All right? To get to 20, we need the 12 and the 10. So I would say my true analysis of the power of each of these people, the 12 and 10 have equal power. This is what I mean by what I said before. The answers are not obvious. Just looking at the numbers, you wouldn't get this impression. But if you think closely about it, you will realize the 12 and the 10 have equal power in this system. And can we say something about these guys, the 5 and the 1 and the 1? When I think about them, I would say, actually, like this 1, for example, there is no scenario in which the 1 can make a difference, right? It's because these other ones, it's never possible that these other ones say add up to 19, and then that last 1 really matters when you add it in or when you don't. In fact, the 5 even cannot make a difference in any scenario, all right? So 10 and the 12 and the 10 have equal power, and the 5, 1, and 1 have no power. All right? Just because it looks like they have some power, according to the numbers, on paper, it seems like their votes count for something. But just because of the way that the system is arranged, actually, when you think about it more carefully, their votes don't really count for anything. They can never influence the outcome. All right? Think about the Electoral College then. It's natural to ask similar questions about this. Who is the most powerful in the Electoral College? Well, California has the biggest number. But maybe actually, is it possible that California and Texas actually have equal power? Now, they have different numbers there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that California actually has more power than the Texas. And maybe, Delaware gets 3 votes. It seems like this means that Delaware has like a little bit of power. Maybe actually Delaware has no power at all, though, for the same reason as this down here, right?
Historically, Florida has been a deciding state.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah, Florida is
In times.
right. Florida is often regarded as super important. I think that's because they have a lot. This number is fairly high, and Florida is also kind of like a battleground. Nowadays, California is reliably Democrat and Texas is reliably Republican, so people don't really think about them as often as far as power, even though California does have more power than Florida. Although maybe they're the same just because of the numbers. All right, so this is what, for the next few weeks, we're going to talk about. How can you actually analyze this? Here we just looked at it and thought really hard, but we need some real structured ways of analyzing that. All right, that'll do.